Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Robbins, and welcome to LPLE from Dialogue FM. We're the podcast that lets you practice listening in English. We speak English slowly and clearly so that you can follow along and understand native English speakers more easily. I'm excited to help you improve your English listening skill, as well as help you learn new vocabulary, grammar, and idioms commonly heard in conversations among native English speakers. If you want to practice listening in English, then we invite you to join our conversation. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Jesse.
You and I have a lot of things in common. We love explaining the English language and helping others learn English. It's a lot of fun. We also have a lot of travel experience. In your case, you lived in France, and in my case, I lived in Japan and in Vietnam. So I figured we could talk about that experience of living in another country, and more specifically, talking about what it was like for us to try and fit in to those different countries and cultures. So I'm really curious, for you as a Caucasian American moving to France and living in France and speaking French, was it easy for you to fit in?
You would think it would be, because a number of reasons. The French are quite a mixed society, as we are. It's quite racially mixed, but still predominantly Caucasian. Also, I am a little bit smaller than your average American woman, and particularly when I lived there, I could say that I just fit better in terms of my size. People were tended to be a little bit shorter and slenderer than Americans, so I should have fit in. I should say, live for almost a year in Romania, about 20 years after that experience in France. And let me just say that the two experiences, despite the fact that in both places I was a Caucasian among Caucasians, in both cases in each case, the situation was very different. I should have fit in. The ways in which I did not fit in were trickier. It had to do with my having difficulty accepting certain kinds of behavior, or with my not yet learning that reality is a relative thing. And what is right and what is wrong, what is polite and what is impolite, those things are relative and very culture dependent. So I would say for the first 2 years that I lived in France, looking at me on the street, listening to me talk, at least for a short time, I could fit. But in terms of knowing what to expect from other people, being extremely upset by certain behaviors towards me, I didn't fit at all. It took about 2 or 2.5 years of living there before I could read the social situations well, usually get the results I expected, etc. So I fit in visually because my French was very good, or quite good. I fit in pretty well in terms of not being recognized immediately as a foreigner.
Well, that's interesting. That's the first question I wanted to ask you, which is, would French locals of any kind, of any ethnic background, would they come up to you and talk to you in French? If you're sitting at a cafe, would the person taking your order talk to you in French?
Oh, of course, immediately. Yes. Yeah, there was no... certainly, this was many years ago, and the French were not as comfortable with speaking English as so many younger French people are now. So, first of all, French might have been the only possibility they had. Second, I fit in when I walked, when I moved. I learned very quickly to make my gestures, certain kinds of gestures, and my body language. I learned to make it smaller, to fit the smaller spaces and the crowded streets. So I would say that very quickly, even my body language was okay. It was just the cultural expectations. And there were times when it was incredibly frustrating. But in the end, it worked.
That's fantastic. When I think back to my first time living in Japan for 3 months, now, 3 months is a short time. Nevertheless, it was still 3 months, which is enough time for me to understand local transportation, how to pay a cell phone bill, how to order food at restaurants. However, if you look at me, I'm clearly not Japanese. So in your situation, there are many external, visual cues and signals that could tell a French local that you are French or possibly French. For me, there are no physical characteristics at all. I look 100% foreign.
Right.
So, for me, I don't think that I could ever 100% fit into Japan, even after 3 months. Now, that is not a bad thing. That is Japanese society. I am always going to look different from a Japanese person. However, I felt very frustrated at times because I was rather young at the time, 21, 22. At that time, I just wanted to fit in wherever I went.
Yes.
It was an unrealistic expectation. I somehow wanted to feel like Japan was home, especially after I spent so much time learning the language, learning the culture, watching the television shows. I felt like I knew enough about Japanese pop culture to feel like I could maybe fit in and feel more comfortable. In the end, I realized that it's okay if I don't fit in. It's okay if Japanese people assume that I cannot speak Japanese. It's okay if it's a little harder for me to make new friends in Japan. These are not bad things. This is just reality, the word you used before.
Could I ask you, did waiters in restaurants immediately speak to you in English?
I think it depends. So it depends on how many foreigners are in that particular area.
Yes.
So, for example, that's a great question because I did not live in the main city of Tokyo. I lived in a small suburb about 30 or 40 minutes away by train. Okay. Now, because I live in that suburb, there are literally 2 or 3 foreigners that I would see around that busy train station of that suburb, which is to say there are not many foreigners. Now, not every foreigner speaks English. So, the chances that a Japanese local living in that area to meet a foreigner who speaks English is pretty small. So the waiters and everybody else in that area, when I would have drinks with friends or go to a pizza store, whatever, they would all speak Japanese. And it's not because they assumed that I'm Japanese. That's not possible. It's because, like in your situation, the exact same thing, English wasn't that strong for them.
They just spoke Japanese. That was the only option, in a sense. Yeah.
But it's funny because when I could respond in Japanese, then they're surprised. It was beautiful because they would speak to me in Japanese. I think to myself, this is fantastic. I'm going to practice. I speak Japanese back and they're surprised. And then I'm surprised that they're surprised. And then it's just like funny conversation after.
So, and I'm sure they were pleased too.
I think so.
Yes, because it takes a huge effort. It's very different. Mm-hmm. I really resonated to what you said about being 21 or 22, and you wanted that to be home. You wanted to fit in 100%. That was such a strong desire for me when I was young and living in France, in Paris, mostly. It was very strong. And then many years later, when I lived in Romania for a year, first of all, I had almost no Romanian when I went there. Second of all, the way I walked, the way I did everything marked me as a foreigner, and I didn't care. It was okay. I was very happy to learn a little Romanian, to use a lot of sign language, and I guess what I understood was that being a foreigner gave me a little bit of extra leeway. If I made a terrible mistake, people might laugh instead of become angry. The main thing is that it did not prevent me from having wonderful human connections and relationships and conversations. And if anything, it taught me that the world is a very big place and people from all over the world really could get together and understand each other. So in a way, the fact that I had no expectation of fitting in, I came to teach in a university in Romania. I came to teach English, and that was my job. And the rest of the time, it was an adventure for them to discover a foreigner and me to discover them. And in fact, I felt so much freer when I didn't care at all about fitting in.
Well, that reminds me now of my own time living in Vietnam. Right? So much like you, and this is another example of how much we have in common. Because similar to how you lived in Romania and you pretty much stopped caring about trying to fit in. I felt the same way when I lived in Vietnam for 10 months. Now, again, I studied Vietnamese for 3 years. I could communicate fine. I could go around town very comfortably. I also realized I don't look Vietnamese at all. Now, unlike Japan, when I wouldn't say most, but there's many Japanese who are happy when I could speak Japanese with them. It's also common for foreigners to learn Japanese because it's a popular language. There's many classes available to learn Japanese. However, for Vietnamese, it is very uncommon, almost very rare that a foreigner learns Vietnamese beyond the basic level. So many foreigners take a beginner Vietnamese class. So that way they can say, "Hello, how are you? May I have a glass of water?" However, I can talk about politics. So my level is a little more sophisticated, higher. So when I talk to Vietnamese, immediately they always talk to me in English first. Even in the suburbs. Oh yeah. Most of the time, Vietnamese, if they have any bit of education, will try to practice their English with me, which is fine. And then, when I speak in Vietnamese, the level of surprise is much higher than in Japan. In Japan, it's mild surprise. "Oh, you speak Japanese. Wow, that's really cool." In Vietnam, they are almost shocked. Like, to the point where they don't know how to respond.
It's a sort of cognitive dissonance.
That's a great word. Cognitive dissonance. Exactly. So when I speak Vietnamese to them, they're shocked, they're happy, they're amused. More Vietnamese listening on the conversation will join the conversation. Now, that sounds like I'm fitting in. That's not fitting in. Fitting in would be if I spoke Vietnamese, they would say, "Cool," and then do something else. I could never fit in Vietnam. And that is okay. 100% okay. I love talking about our time abroad. We have so many stories that we can share with each other. And more importantly, that we could share for the listeners. Thank you for listening to this episode of LPLE. Let's practice listening in English from Dialogue FM. Subscribe to LPLE on iTunes to hear the latest episodes, or listen to past episodes on our website, dialogue.fm. That's dialog.fm. If you have questions or comments about English, or if you would like for us to use a word, grammar, or idiom in our conversation so you can learn how to use it correctly, we would love to hear from you on Twitter at dialogue.fm or Facebook at facebook.com/dialoguefm.